All right, let's talk about one of the biggest head-scratchers in all of Western philosophy. We're talking about Plato. And you have to understand, this guy wasn't just a philosopher. He was one of the most brilliant, most poetic writers of the ancient world. But here's the paradox. This master of the written word had a really complicated, almost hostile view of poetry itself.
I mean, listen to this. In his most famous work, The Republic, Plato does not pull any punches. He basically says that poets are a danger to society, that they teach all the wrong lessons, and that their work needs to be censored to protect everyone. He thought their stories could literally twist your soul out of shape. It's a pretty harsh take, especially coming from a man whose own writing is just so full of powerful, unforgettable images.
And that, right there, that's the mystery we're going to unravel. If Plato thought poets were such a threat, why are his own books jam-packed with these incredible myths, these amazing metaphors, these wild allegories? What was his game?
To figure this out, we have to start with this bizarre image of the poet who hated poetry. You know, there's this great story, it's probably not true, but it's a great story about a young Plato. He'd written some tragedies, he was all set to enter them in a competition. But then he met Socrates. And apparently, whatever Socrates said to him totally blew his mind, because the story goes that Plato went straight home and burned his plays, just like that.
Now, whether that story is true or not, the idea behind it is huge. Plato, this guy with massive poetic talent, seems to make a deliberate choice to turn his back on the popular art forms of his day. And instead of just complaining, he invents something totally new, the Socratic dialogue. It's like a new kind of philosophical art form that he designed specifically to fix the things he thought were broken in regular poetry.
So let's do what Plato did. Let's put poetry on trial. What were the actual charges he was bringing against the literary heavyweights of his day, guys like Homer?
Okay, charge number 1, bad education. Plato looked at Homer's epics and said, these stories are teaching kids to admire the wrong kind of hero. The Homeric hero, Achilles, he's all about rage and passion and violence, mostly serving his own ego. Plato wanted to swap him out for a totally new ideal, the philosophical hero, Socrates, a guy who's all about reason, logic, and actually making the people around him better.
And this is where you see Plato's genius, this incredible bit of intellectual judo. Remember, his hero, his mentor Socrates, was literally executed on the charge of corrupting the youth. So what does Plato do? In The Republic, he takes that exact charge and flips it right back on his opponents. He argues that the real youth corruptors aren't the philosophers. They're the poets who fill kids' heads with stories about terrible gods and selfish, violent heroes. His second charge was about reality itself. Think of it like a ladder. At the very top, the highest rung, you've got the realm of forms. This is where the perfect, pure ideas of things exist, like the perfect idea of a circle, or justice itself. One step down is the physical world we live in, which is just full of imperfect copies of those forms. And then way down at the bottom, that's where art lives. For Plato, a painting of a bed or a poem about justice is just an imitation of a copy. It's a shadow of a shadow, twice removed from what's actually real.
So hold on. If poetry and art are on the bottom rung of the reality ladder, about as far from the truth as you can possibly get, why is Plato's own work absolutely full of it? We are right back at our big mystery. What is his secret?
Well, the answer is actually pretty practical. Plato knew that poetry was just too powerful to get rid of. It was like this untamed, dangerous animal, sure, but it could also be an unbelievably powerful tool. So the smart philosopher doesn't try to kill poetry, he tries to tame it. He wants to domesticate it, to put all of its raw emotional power to work for philosophy.
Plato's whole strategy, then, was to use what you might call lies that tell the truth. He would use these myths, not to talk about what literally happened in history, but to sneak these really deep philosophical and moral truths into the reader's mind, in a way that just dry logical argument couldn't.
These myths that he created had a few very specific jobs. For one, they could protect people who weren't ready for heavy-duty philosophy by giving them a good rule of thumb to live by. They could also be a kind of on-ramp to get students started on the path to real knowledge. And, maybe most importantly, they could lay down the foundational beliefs of his whole system, the starting points that you can't really prove with logic alone.
And to see just how this works, let's take a look at a really quick, kind of chilling story from The Republic. It's about a shepherd who finds a very special ring.
So the shepherd finds a bronze horse, which is a pretty clear dig at Homer's Trojan horse, and he goes down into the earth, which is the exact opposite of a philosophical journey up towards the light. Inside, he finds a dead body with a ring, and he just takes it. He figures out it makes him invisible, and what does he do with this incredible power? Seduces the queen, murders the king, and takes over the kingdom. See? It's not just some fantasy story. It's a brutal little parable about how absolute power without morality corrupts absolute.
And that brings us to one of Plato's most controversial and, yeah, frankly, one of his most uncomfortable ideas, the noble lie. This is the idea that a ruling class can and should tell a foundational myth, a lie, to the public in order to keep society stable and harmonious.
Plato's own big example of a noble lie is what's called the myth of the metals. The rulers would tell everyone this story, that they weren't really born from their parents, but were formed inside the earth, and that the gods mixed different metals into their souls. Gold for the rulers, silver for the soldiers, and bronze for the workers. Now, the point isn't for people to believe this is literally true. The point is to get everyone to accept the foundational, unprovable idea of his society, that people are born fundamentally unequal, and that's why the social hierarchy is the way it is.
Okay, I know. This sounds pretty ancient and maybe even a little sinister. But Plato's core insight that every society is built on these foundational stories is as relevant as ever. Let's bring this into our own world for a second. I mean, think about it. Do any of us actually believe a tortoise once beat a hare in a race? No, of course not. But we tell that story to our kids because it teaches a deeper moral truth, that slow and steady wins the race. It's a useful lie. It's not a coincidence that Socrates himself supposedly spent his last days in jail putting Aesop's fables into poetry.
Or let's take an even bigger one, the phrase, all people are created equal. Now, is that a literal, scientific fact? I mean, are we all equally strong or smart or artistic? Clearly not. But in a Platonic sense, you could see it as a foundational myth, an unprovable starting point, that we as a society have chosen to build our entire legal and moral system on, because we believe it leads to a better world.
And for a much lighter example, think about Santa Claus. Every year, millions of adults engage in this huge, coordinated myth about a man in a red suit who judges your behavior. Is that a bad lie, or is it a good myth that encourages kids to behave?
And that, right there, is the bottom line for Plato. The ultimate test for any story, whether it's Homer's Iliad or the story of Santa, is just super practical. It has nothing to do with if it's literally true. A good myth is a story that makes people act in good ways. A bad myth is one that makes them act in bad ways. That's it. It's that simple.
So that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Plato wanted to build his ideal city on a foundation of carefully chosen good myths. So the question for us is, what are the myths we're living by? What are the noble lies, the useful stories, the foundational fictions that are quietly shaping the world around you right now?